When I was young and living with relatives, I once stole an egg from my aunt out of greed. She smashed my face with a high heel, leaving a deep, ugly scar on my brow. Later, when I was taken back home, I got into a fight with my younger brother and accidentally pushed him, causing a small scar near the corner of his eye. My mother pointed her finger at me and cursed. "You're so wicked at such a young age. You ruined your face and now want to ruin your brother's too. I should have strangled you at birth to save my son from your harm." My father, furious, whipped me with a belt. After taking a beating, I came to a realization. There really are parents in this world who don't love their children. Truly there are. When I was 9, my father brought me home. I remember it was snowing heavily that day. My father was on a bicycle, and I sat on the back seat, holding a large bundle in my arms. It was my clothing and belongings. My grandmother packed my things while my aunt sneered from the side. She's been freeloading here for years, and now her parents suddenly remember they have a daughter. How rare. Hurry and pack your raggedest stuff and leave. Go home and enjoy your good life. I was too naive then to catch the sarcasm in her words. All I heard was that I was going to have a good life. Believing it to be true, I leaped toward the unfamiliar figure I hadn't seen in years, called him timidly, "Dad," and happily climbed onto the bicycle. My father answered briefly, loaded my bundle, and pedaled off with me. Behind us, my grandmother, with tear-filled eyes, called out her final instructions. "Be good, listen to your parents, study hard, and don't upset them." I nodded vigorously. The bicycle wheels turned as I waved goodbye to my grandmother. The gardenia tree I loved so much, along with my grandmother's stooped figure, faded from sight until they disappeared completely. We traveled a long way, crossing several villages, rice fields, dikes, and canals. Only after navigating a winding, muddy path did we finally reach the end. What lay ahead was a broad asphalt road flanked by rows of elegant little villas, beautifully arranged and stretching as far as the eye could see. I was overjoyed. This place was more vibrant and dazzling than the markets my grandmother used to take me to. I loved going to the market, even though it meant waking up very early and walking long distances. But after finishing her shopping, my grandmother would always hand me a few leftover coins, letting me buy my favorite snacks and candies. That was when I was happiest, clutching those coins tightly as I excitedly wandered among the stalls. "This one's tasty. I'll get 50 cents worth. That one's been on my mind for a while. I'll get 50 cents of that too." Back then, money seemed to go so far. A few coins could buy me a whole pile of delicious treats. I'd hand a candy to my grandmother. She'd refuse, saying, "I don't like sweets. They make my teeth ache." Then I'd dig out a packet of spicy strips from my stuffed pockets. She wouldn't eat those either. "You eat them yourself. I'm not into snacks." So I happily munched on my snacks, following behind her, trudging step by step along the road home. Market days were the happiest days of my life. I'd set out in the morning full of excitement and anticipation. The scenery along the way was beautiful and refreshing. By evening, I'd return completely satisfied, with all kinds of goodies in hand. Those were among the rare moments of joy in my childhood memories. It was getting dark. My father pedaled the bike, panting heavily, and said, "We're almost home. Do you see the house with the red lanterns hanging at the gate up ahead? That's our home." Our home. I silently repeated those words, savoring them. Finally, I had a home. I was no longer the worthless burden my aunt always claimed no one wanted. So, I widened my eyes, gazing at the house with the red lanterns in the distance, my heart brimming with hope and anticipation. When we arrived, my mother was waiting at the door. "Call her, Mom," my father said as he took the bundle from my arms and steadied the bike for me to get down. I looked at the woman standing before me, her features sharp and stern. She resembled the mother I had pictured countless times in my mind, but there was also something different. The mother in my memory was gentler. I vaguely remembered seeing her once when I was 5, when she came to visit my grandmother's house. Actually, she didn't come specifically for me. She was there because my younger brother had fallen sick and wasn't recovering. She had come to ask my grandmother to find a folk remedy from the village barefoot doctor. That day, I was late coming home from school, running all the way in fear of being scolded. She waited for me at the door, helped take off my school bag, and patted my back, telling me to slow down. At dinner, noticing my messy hair, she tied it up neatly with a hairband. That was my only memory of her. I hesitated, then softly murmured, "Mom." She raised her eyes to glance at me. After brushing the snow off my father with a broom, she slowly walked toward me. Standing under the eaves, I hesitated, not daring to enter the house. All my hopes and excitement from the journey were shattered in an instant by her cold demeanor. After stepping inside, my mother found me a pair of slippers to change into. The slippers had a design of pleasant goat on them, lined with thick fleece. They were a bit small, but they were warm. My frozen feet, almost numb, began to thaw, and a warmth seeped into my heart as well. "What's for dinner?" my father asked. Wearing an apron and busy in the kitchen, my mother replied without stopping her hands, "It's freezing today, so I'm making dumplings to warm us up." Then, turning to me, she asked, "Do you like dumplings, girl?" I nodded eagerly, worried she couldn't see my enthusiasm in the dim light, and quickly added, "Yes, I do. I love them." When the meal was ready, a little boy came storming in. He burst through the heavy curtain meant to block the wind, and the hard corner hit my face, stinging painfully. I covered my face but didn't cry out. No one noticed anyway. My father was busy sweeping the snow in the yard. My mother was focused on cooking dumplings in the kitchen. I knew the boy was my younger brother. My grandmother had told me about him, about how much hardship my mother endured to give birth to him, losing several girls in between before finally having him. He was her treasure. My grandmother had repeatedly reminded me to be considerate of him and not to upset my parents. I kept her words deeply etched in my heart. So, from the bottom of my heart, I feared him a little. My brother ran into the kitchen, clinging to my mother's leg and whining, "Mom, isn't dinner ready yet? I'm starving." The indifference on my mother's face instantly melted into a smile. She gently patted his head, scolding him playfully. "Where have you been running wild this time? You wouldn't come home unless you were starving, would you? Go wash your hands. The dumplings are almost ready." Peeking through the half-open kitchen door, I watched this warm, harmonious scene bathed in orange light. Like a thief spying on someone else's happiness, I felt a quiet sense of loneliness. When the steaming hot dumplings were finally served, my mother called me over to eat. It was then that my brother noticed me sitting alone in the corner. Pointing at me in surprise, he asked, "Who is she?" "She's your sister," my mother replied. Shocked, he exclaimed, "Where did I suddenly get a sister from?" My father added, "She grew up at your grandmother's, so you haven't seen her before. From now on, get along with her and no fighting." Tilting his chin, my brother sneered, "She's from the countryside. No wonder she looks so shabby." He was only 7 at the time, yet he already understood the difference between city folk and country folk. He was the lofty city kid, and I was the shabby one from the countryside. My mother slapped him lightly, which to me felt more like a mere tap. Starving, I quickly picked up my chopsticks and grabbed a dumpling. The rich aroma of the meat filled my mouth, making me even hungrier. After eating 3 dumplings in a row, I noticed no one else had started eating. My mother was still busy in the kitchen, my father was preparing dipping sauce, and my brother suddenly threw his chopsticks down. "Mom, I don't want boiled dumplings. I want pan-fried ones." Without hesitation, my mother replied, "I know, I've already made them for you. They'll be ready in a moment." I put down my chopsticks, waiting for everyone to start eating together. After a while, my mother brought over a plate of pan-fried dumplings, placing it directly in front of my brother. That plate of golden dumplings, emitting a rich, fragrant aroma, was something I had never tasted before. I couldn't help swallowing my saliva, which my mother noticed from the corner of her eye. She paused, then suggested to my brother, "Can you finish all of these by yourself? Share a few with your sister. Let her have a taste." My brother shook his head, guarding the plate like it was a treasure. "No way. There's not even enough for me. Why should I give her any? Are you always this selfish when eating?" My mother reached toward his plate as if to grab some, but my father stopped her, his tone calm. "He's a boy growing up. Let him eat more. A dumpling is just a dumpling, fried or boiled. It's all the same." I froze, lifting my head to look at my father. He was holding his bowl, half of his face obscured by its rim. I couldn't see his expression, but in that moment, he felt different from the man who had carried me home under the starry sky, braving the snow. Or maybe he wasn't different. Maybe I had just imagined him to be better than he was. "Exactly. Dad's right." My brother's triumphant voice snapped me out of my thoughts. Sensing the tense atmosphere, I quickly said, "It's fine. I don't like fried dumplings anyway. I prefer boiled ones." After dinner, my mother went to wash the dishes. I remembered how I used to help my grandmother after meals, wiping the table, sweeping the floor, washing the dishes. My grandmother always said I had to be diligent, observant, and quick to help so I wouldn't annoy others. The night before I left, she had reminded me again to work hard at home, to make my parents happy. At the time, I didn't understand why I had to be so careful in my own home. At my grandmother's, I was an outsider and had to tread lightly. But why did I have to do the same here? They were my biological parents. Did I still have to please them? Couldn't they accept me as I was? I didn't understand, but I didn't ask. Instead, I nodded obediently. I knew my grandmother was always right. She would never steer me wrong. So, I picked up the broom from the corner and swept the floor. "Girl, there's hot water in the pot. Bring the red basin from the door and scoop some to soak your feet," my mother called from the kitchen. "Okay," I replied. I looked around the door, but couldn't find the red basin. I went inside to ask my brother. He was reading a storybook and either didn't hear me or chose to ignore me. "You can't even find a simple basin? Always dawdling, just good for eating." My mother suddenly raised her voice, startling me. My voice trembled as I answered, "It's not at the door." I couldn't find it. My mother rushed out, checked by the door, and then turned to my brother. "Where's the wash basin?" Only then did my brother answer, "Dad took it to use for his turtles." Muttering under her breath, my mother picked up a broom to sweep the floor but paused when she saw it was already clean. Her expression softened. She fetched a basin from the inner room, scooped half a basin of water, and handed it to me. "Here, soak your feet." I was so taken aback by the kindness that I hesitated before accepting the basin. Just as I was about to soak my feet, my brother shouted, "Why is she wearing my slippers?" My mother tried to reason with him. "I forgot to buy her a pair. Didn't I just get you new ones the other day? Let her use your old ones for now." "No. Those are my favorite pleasant goat slippers. She can't wear them." With that, he stormed over, yanked the slippers off my feet, and left me barefoot on the floor. As he pulled me off the stool, my hand accidentally tipped the basin of hot water, spilling it everywhere. Luckily, I was wearing a thick cotton coat, so I wasn't burned. But I still wanted to cry, out of sadness, frustration, and an overwhelming sense of grievance. The coat was brand new, made by my grandmother this year. She had stuffed it with layers of cotton and stitched it with fine, tight seams. It was thick and warm, my prized possession. I had planned to save it for New Year's, reluctant to wear it until then. But before I left, my grandmother insisted I wear it, saying, "Put on your new clothes, go to your new home, and start a new life." Now, at this so-called new home, my new coat was dirty, and I was a mess. I sat on the floor, too upset to get up for a long time. Meanwhile, my mother ignored me, focusing instead on comforting my brother. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have given your things to your sister without asking you first." Then she finally turned to me, still shivering and soaked. "You're okay, right? Go change into something dry before you catch a cold." Only after calming my brother did she give me permission to move. Barefoot, I found an old cotton jacket in my bundle, changed into it, and slipped on my worn-out sandals. Silently, I picked up the mop and cleaned up the spilled water. Noticing my red, freezing feet, my mother frowned. "Don't you even have a pair of cotton slippers?"
I did.
My grandmother had made me a pair, cutting the back open so they could double as slippers. But my feet were wet, and I didn't dare ask for a towel to dry them, afraid of ruining the cotton shoes. So, I didn't bring them out. Seeing my silence, she didn't press further. That night, lying in the cold, hard bed, I shivered uncontrollably. I curled into a tight ball, hoping it would make me feel warmer. Through the thin walls, I could hear the television in the next room and my brother's cheerful shouts. "I want to watch cartoons. I want Pleasant Goat and Big Big Wolf." Unable to hold it in any longer, I pulled the blanket over my head and cried quietly. I missed my grandmother.
Eventually, I stayed in that house.
I had already realized that whether or not this house could truly accommodate me, it was my only option. My grandmother's house wasn't really hers either. It belonged to my uncle and aunt. The house, brick by brick, had been built by my grandmother and grandfather. But after my grandfather passed away, it naturally became my uncle and aunt's property. My grandmother, like me, became someone who was living under someone else's roof. In the earlier years, my grandmother was still strong and able to help my aunt take care of the kids, do the laundry, clean the house, and manage the few fields they had. My aunt didn't say much then. But as my grandmother grew older and her hands and feet became less agile, she could no longer do the heavy work. My aunt became more and more resentful of her and, by extension, more dismissive of me. During the winter break of my 9th year, I became seriously ill, running a high fever for a week straight. My grandmother carried me to the next village daily, for 4 drips. I'd feel better during the day after the treatment, but by night, the fever would return. The barefoot doctor in the neighboring village advised my grandmother to take me to a proper hospital quickly, lest the illness worsen. My grandmother called my uncle, who took leave from work and rushed home on his motorcycle, swiftly taking me to the hospital. My grandmother had no money, so my uncle paid for my hospitalization and completed the procedures. I was diagnosed with acute pneumonia and spent a week in the hospital, costing several hundred yuan before I was finally cured. When we returned home, the house was in disarray, the floor littered with broken pots and pans. My aunt was lying on the bed, crying. Seeing me come in, she sat up, glared at me fiercely, then turned to my grandmother and shouted. Are her parents only capable of having children, not raising them? We're the ones paying for her food, shelter, and now even her medical bills. Is this child mine? I must have been cursed to marry into this family. My grandmother quickly tried to explain. I called you Chia, my mother. She said she'd transfer the money for the hospital bills in a couple of days when she has time to go to the bank. I don't want to hear it. I'll say it plain and simple. If you don't send her away before the new year, I'm divorcing your son. That day was the 20th of the lunar calendar. My aunt had issued an ultimatum. My grandmother knew she meant it this time, so she had no choice but to call my mother. I didn't know what my grandmother said to her, but I vaguely remember her crying. After hanging up the phone, she wiped her nose and came over to hold me tightly in her arms. She murmured softly, "Child, you must strive to succeed. One day, when you're capable, no one will dare look down on you again." I understood her words to some extent. Seeing me nod, my grandmother sighed deeply and held me even tighter. My mother rented a storefront on the pedestrian street in the county to sell clothes, and my father worked at the county's cotton mill. Their income was decent. They bought a house in the county, living a life that was neither luxurious nor impoverished. My father transferred me to the county's 3rd elementary school. I was quite happy with the change. Although it was far from home, the school was big, and the desks in the classrooms were brand new, far better than the ones in my village school. My younger brother, 2 years my junior, was in 2nd grade and attended the 1st elementary school near the pedestrian street. Every morning, my mother would first take my brother to school before heading to her shop. In the evening, my brother would go to her shop after school and wait until she closed up before they headed home together. My school, however, was much farther from my brother's school and my mother's shop. Every morning, I had to wake up before dawn, carrying my heavy school bag as I walked all the way from the eastern side of town to the western side under the faint starlight. If I walked too slowly, I'd risk being late. I envied my brother, who didn't have to wake up early and could enjoy more sleep. His school was so close that he didn't have to walk far either. My desk mate also had a younger brother. Her mother would ride an electric bike every morning, taking her brother in the front seat and her in the back. Sometimes, I would glance at my mother's electric bike and silently wonder, why can't my brother and I go to the same school? That bike could easily carry both of us. I soon found the answer to my question. My father's cousin had a grandson who had been attending kindergarten in the village. That year, he was set to start elementary school, so they asked my father to help transfer him to a school in the county. My father agreed readily. That's easy. The vice principal of 3rd Elementary is my classmate. One meal will settle it. But over the phone, his cousin's son hesitated and said, "Brother, I was actually hoping to get Dandon into 1st Elementary. I've heard that 3rd Elementary's teaching quality isn't great. It doesn't even come close to 1st Elementary." My father was eating dinner at the time and had put the call on speaker. After the call ended, my father's expression remained indifferent, but my mother was visibly furious. She muttered angrily, "He makes it sound so easy. Who doesn't know that 1st Elementary is better? Does he think just anyone can get in?" When we got Hao, my brother, into 1st Elementary, we had to spend over 10,000 yuan on bribes and gifts. Taking a sip of porridge, she continued, "What's wrong with 3rd Elementary? So what if it's a little farther and not as good? If you're truly talented, you'll shine no matter where you are." I looked up at her as she spoke with righteous indignation, but I couldn't help feeling uncomfortable. So they knew all along that 1st Elementary was better and that 3rd Elementary was farther and worse. They knew, but they were willing to spend money and pull strings to get my brother into 1st Elementary, yet they wouldn't do the same for me. This wasn't the first time I'd realized the disparity between how they treated me and my brother, but it was the most glaring moment. Child, you must strive to succeed. One day, when you're capable, no one will dare look down on you again. I remembered my grandmother's words and clenched my fists tightly. I had always done well in school. Back in the village, I was always at the top of my class. When I first transferred to 3rd Elementary, I struggled to adapt. In my village school, teachers would first explain the material thoroughly, and after we understood it, they would occasionally review key points with us. Here, the teachers did things differently. They expected us to self-study first, preview the material on our own, identify parts we didn't understand, and mark them for discussion in class the next day. At first, I wasn't used to this method, but I forced myself to adapt. For topics and examples I didn't understand, I would circle them with a red pen and pay extra attention during the teacher's explanation the next day. Gradually, I realized this approach was effective. I was able to fully grasp and memorize concepts, rarely making mistakes on similar problems afterward. Once I adjusted to the teaching style, my grades improved steadily, and I gained confidence. Children's hearts are pure. They didn't mock me for being from the countryside or for speaking imperfect Mandarin. They didn't look down on me for wearing old, shabby clothes. At the end of 5th grade, I scored double 100s and ranked first in my class. The school gave me a certificate of achievement. On my way home, I occasionally stopped to take the certificate out of my bag, holding it and grinning foolishly before carefully putting it away again. I remember the wind that day was soft, and the air was sweet. I jogged all the way home. My father got off work early and was cooking in the kitchen. I lingered, wanting to show him the certificate, but feeling too shy. Finally, he noticed me and casually asked, "Did your final exam results come out yet?" I tried to calm my pounding heart, replying in a seemingly calm voice, "Yes, they're out." "How much did you score?" "I got double 100s. "Oh, really? That's great, really impressive." My father came out of the kitchen and gave me a thumbs up. Encouraged by his words, I broke into a smile. reaching into my bag to pull out the certificate and show it to him. "Look, this is my certificate." "Dad, look, I got a certificate." But my words were completely drowned out by my brother's loud voice. It seemed my father only heard my brother boasting. "Oh, my precious son is really amazing. What gift do you want? Tell Daddy, and I'll take you to buy it tomorrow." My father rushed to the door, picked up my brother, and planted a loud kiss on his face. My mother smiled happily as she watched the playful scene between father and son. I stood quietly in the kitchen doorway, feeling that the 3-meter gap from the living room felt like an insurmountable chasm. On the other side of the chasm was their happy, unbreakable family of 3. On my side was me, the one who had been forgotten and abandoned from the moment I was born. I watched the scene in silence, slowly putting the certificate away. The next day, my father took the day off, and my mother, for once, didn't go to the shop. After lunch, my father rode his new motorcycle, taking all 3 of us to the city to buy New Year's goods. As soon as we entered the supermarket, my brother began shouting that he wanted to buy a toy. My father lifted him onto his shoulders and weaved through the crowd, heading straight for the toy section. My mother went to pick out New Year's goods. I glanced at her back, then looked at my father and brother. After a moment's hesitation, I decided to follow them. My brother wanted a toy gun that looked very realistic, with several detachable magazines. My father looked at the price and frowned, but in the end, he gritted his teeth and said, "Fine." Then my father turned to me and said, "What do you want? Pick something for yourself." I was a bit surprised and quickly nodded. I looked around the shelves and finally chose a small Barbie doll. The doll was small, but her face was beautifully detailed, and she had 2 interchangeable dresses. I hugged my Barbie doll while my brother held his toy gun. Both of us were ecstatic. At the checkout, when my mother heard that the toy gun cost 100 yuan, her eyes widened. "This thing costs as much as 10 kilograms of meat. It's too expensive. How? Pick a different toy." Upon hearing this, my brother immediately began to cry, tugging at my mother's sleeve and throwing a tantrum. "Mom, I really want this. Please buy it for me." Seeing him cry, my mother's tone softened immediately. My father, standing beside her, chimed in, "The kid likes it. Just buy it. Isn't that what earning money is for? To spend it?" Only then did my mother reluctantly put the toy gun on the counter to be scanned and gradually finish scanning all the items in the cart. The last one was my Barbie doll. My mother asked the cashier, "How much is this?" 30 yuan. My mother grabbed it and shouted at me, "This little thing costs 30 yuan? You're wasting money. This is something 2 or 3-year-olds play with. How old are you? And you still want to play with this? Forget it. I'll buy you some new hair ties later." I wanted to argue, but I didn't dare. I anxiously searched the crowd for my father, hoping he would speak up for me like he had for my brother. But I only saw him, holding my brother, pushing through the crowd to watch a clown performance. So, despite getting double 100s, despite being obedient, thoughtful, and not fighting for attention, I still didn't get the gift that was rightfully mine, even though it was only worth 30 yuan. Half a year passed in the blink of an eye. My birthday is in August, and I had no hope that they would remember it. But the day before my birthday, my father won 200 yuan from the lottery. He was so happy that he told my mother he would take us out to a restaurant and buy me a big cake. So I started to feel some hope. On my birthday, my father first dropped my mother, brother, and me off at the restaurant, saying he was going to pick up the cake. My brother insisted on going with him. When the cake arrived, my brother eagerly opened it. "Mom, I picked this out for her. Isn't it pretty?" My brother never called me sister, he always just called me by my name. When I saw the cake, I noticed it had my brother's favorite character, Pleasant Goat, on it. It was fine, though I liked Pleasant Goat too. I happily ate the cake. My mother shyly pulled a box from her bag and said, "I didn't buy you the Barbie doll last time, so I got it for you this time." Her expression seemed awkward, like she wanted to apologize but couldn't quite bring herself to say it. Instead, she chose this way to make it up to me. My eyes welled up instantly, and the overwhelming joy and happiness almost made me lose my senses. I took the gift and stammered, "Thank you, Mom." This was the second time I had called her Mom since returning home. She seemed a bit shocked and paused for a moment, then placed a chicken leg into my bowl. My brother, angry, threw his chopsticks down. My mother quickly put another chicken leg into his bowl. But my brother wouldn't eat. He lowered his head and suddenly started crying. "You guys bought a cake for her birthday and now a gift too, but I don't get anything." My mother hurried to comfort him. "Sweetheart, didn't I just buy you a toy car yesterday? Your gift is much more than your sister's. Don't be so petty." My father added, "That's right. You're a big boy now. Don't cry so easily. If you want anything, just tell Dad. I'll buy it for you tomorrow." After a lot of coaxing, they finally managed to calm him down. The family managed to enjoy the meal, albeit in a tense atmosphere. After the meal, my father went to pay the bill, and my mother went to gather the leftovers. Suddenly, my brother lunged at me and snatched the Barbie doll from my hands. "Let me play with it for a bit." No. For some reason, I suddenly became bold. Maybe it was because my parents had been so nice to me today, giving me the courage to stand up to my little tyrant of a brother. I grabbed the doll back from him and dusted it off. My brother lunged at me again, and I couldn't match his strength. "Give it back. That's my gift from Mom and Dad." I shouted at him, but my words only angered him further. He suddenly threw the doll to the ground, then stomped on it with force. The brand new Barbie doll shattered into pieces under his harsh treatment. Furious, I kicked him hard. He retaliated immediately, charging at me like a little bull and ramming his head into my stomach. I winced in pain and instinctively shoved him hard. With a loud bang, his head collided with the corner of the table. He began crying loudly. "What's going on here?" My parents rushed into the room. When they saw my brother crying even louder now that the supporting cast had arrived, my mother immediately went to comfort him. She removed his hand from his forehead, and we both froze in shock. A deep gash ran across the corner of my brother's eye from the table's edge, with beads of blood trickling down. I was terrified. Usually, my mother would be heartbroken even if he just bumped his head lightly, but now this was serious. I had caused trouble. Stupid girl. What kind of force is that? Just as I was about to explain, my mother suddenly stood up, pointing her finger at my face, yelling, "I didn't expect you to be so wicked at such a young age. You ruined your own face, and now you want to ruin your brother's too. If I had known, I would have strangled you at birth, to save my son from being harmed by you." I was stunned, and a wave of pain surged in my heart, as if someone was repeatedly carving it with a small knife. I have a deep, ugly scar on my brow from when I was 5. I had stolen an egg from my aunt when she was resting after childbirth, and she hit me with her high heel. The wound was so deep I could see the bone, and I bled a lot. My grandmother cried as she put medicine on it. Later, when my mother came to visit for New Year, she saw the injury and asked what had happened. I naively thought the woman, who my grandmother had asked me to call Mom, would defend me, so I tearfully explained. To my surprise, she simply replied coldly, "You deserved it. Who told you to steal?" Then, she turned to my aunt with a flattering smile and said, "Kids need to be disciplined when they don't listen." Even though many years have passed, I still clearly remember the indifference in her expression, as though I was a stranger to her. After I returned to this home, occasionally she would be nice to me and smile at me. Over time, I almost convinced myself that it was all a misunderstanding, that she didn't hate me, but just loved my brother more. But now, in this moment, I suddenly realized it was as if she really didn't love me. That's why she would bring up my old scars, using them as weapons to attack me, with the most hurtful words to shame me. I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to hurt him. But no one listened to my explanation. My father angrily pulled out a belt and began hitting me, shouting, "You ungrateful little beast. We spend money on your birthday and buy you gifts, and you want to harm your brother. Today, I'll teach you a lesson." I don't know how long my father hit me with the belt. At first, I cried out in pain, but eventually I stopped crying. It seemed I really couldn't feel the pain anymore. In the end, the restaurant owner couldn't bear to watch anymore. She snatched the belt from my father's hand and scolded him. Fighting between kids is normal, but beating them like this? You're the one with problems. My father, embarrassed in front of everyone, left the restaurant with my mother and brother. Not a single one of them turned back to look at me. I don't know how I made it home. I just know that the road was long and the wind was cold. Even though it wasn't winter, it felt like the wind was cutting my face, stinging with pain. When I got home, my mother came out of the room when she heard the noise. I thought someone had taken you. I ignored her and quietly boiled some water. My body and face were covered in bruises and scratches, and everything hurt when I touched it. I could only carefully wipe myself down with a towel. From that day on, I extinguished the last bit of hope in my heart and never expected anything good from them again. I also stopped fighting with my brother. I just stayed quietly in this family, not vying for anything. Later, I got into a key high school in the city. At that time, the pressure of studying was high, and many parents, in order to ensure their children had good food and sleep, would rent a place near the school to accompany them. I knew I wasn't that lucky, so I obediently chose to live in the school dorm. The winters in the north are very cold, and hot water in the dorm was sold for 50 cents per kettle. My weekly allowance was 55 yuan. A basic breakfast in the cafeteria cost 3 yuan, 2 steamed buns, a bowl of porridge, and half a bowl of vegetables. Lunch was at least 5 yuan, and if it had meat, it cost 8 yuan. Dinner was cheapest with noodles at 2 yuan a bowl. I always try to save, eating the cheapest meals, with exactly 50 yuan spent on food, and the remaining 5 yuan saved for snacks. I couldn't afford to buy hot water, so I washed my face, feet, and even my hair with cold water. As a result, my feet developed frostbite every winter, and later, I would get headaches whenever I felt the wind. I couldn't even wash my thick winter coat properly. Even if I did, it wouldn't dry in the dorm. So I got lazy. On weekends, I'd bring my dirty clothes back home in my suitcase to wash them in the washing machine. When my mother saw this, she scolded me. "You lazy thing. You're 15 or 16 and can't even wash your own clothes." When I was your age, I didn't just wash the whole family's clothes, I also cooked, fed the pigs, and did all the hard work. A lazy and ugly girl like you. How do you expect to get married? As I bowed my head to wash the clothes, I quietly wiped away a few tears. After that, I stopped bringing clothes home. When they became too dirty to wear, I would wash them myself, even if I couldn't clean them properly. If they didn't dry, I would wear them damp. My brother is 2 years younger than me, and during my senior year, he was in his first year of high school. His grades were average, and he got into a regular high school. Halfway through the first semester, he decided he didn't want to stay in the dorm. He complained about the poor dorm conditions and bad food in the cafeteria, insisting that my mother go to stay with him. My parents discussed it until midnight, and the next day, my mother put up a shop for rent sign outside her store. The neighbor tried to advise her. "You've built a good customer base here. Why quit now after all the hard work?" My mother, beaming with pride, replied, "My son is in high school now. I need to go accompany him. Once he gets into college, I'll come back to work." I sometimes ask myself, do I envy my brother? Of course I did, but what's the use of envy? From a young age, I knew I couldn't rely on anyone, and I had to work hard on my own. So I studied day and night, pushing myself to the limit, studying desperately. Effort really paid off, and I achieved excellent results in my college entrance exam. On the day I registered for college, my parents were very happy and said they would take me there, but I refused. I carried my luggage by myself and walked towards the hopeful future that awaited me. My father did send me living expenses on time, but he never called me. My mother didn't contact me either. In my second year of university, my father lost his job, and at the same time, my brother failed his college entrance exam and needed a large sum of money to transfer to another school for a second attempt. So my father stopped my living expenses and told me to figure it out on my own. Thankfully, I was used to hardship, so I managed without much money. After class, I worked in the cafeteria serving meals. Not only did I earn money, but I also got free meals to fill my stomach. When I had no classes, I would distribute flyers, do promotions, or work in a restaurant as a waiter. Whatever work I could find, I was willing to do, no matter how tiring or difficult. I continued to excel in my studies, and in my third year, my counselor helped me apply for student loans and scholarships. From that point on, I never asked my father for a single cent again. During the winter holiday, we went to my uncle's house for the New Year visit. I overheard my mother and grandmother complaining. The older she gets, the less she understands. She never calls us mom or dad. You don't know how cold-hearted she is, never calling home even once during the entire semester. We don't even know who she takes after. Hearing these words, I found them laughable. After all these years, they still hadn't reflected on whether they had done things right or wrong. Instead, they blamed me for being cold-hearted and ungrateful. At the dinner table, my aunt smiled and asked, "Girl, now that you've graduated, where do you plan to settle? Do you still remember when you used to say you'd take care of your grandmother when you grew up?" My aunt was older now, and her gaze was no longer as sharp as I remembered. She seemed a bit more polite to me, but her tone still carried some sharpness. I nodded. I remember. I always keep my word. I had passed the teacher qualification exam, planning to return to my hometown, not for my parents, but for my grandmother. My uncle and aunt had moved to the city with my cousin, leaving my grandmother alone in our hometown. My uncle said that the older my grandmother got, the more stubborn she became. She refused to live a better life with them and insisted on living alone. I knew the reason. My grandmother had spent her entire life lowering herself in front of my aunt, and now that she was old, she didn't want to suffer anymore, which is why she refused to go with them. I couldn't bear to leave my grandmother alone. I wanted to stay with her and live a peaceful, simple life. I returned to my hometown to teach. When my parents found out, they were furious. They had worked hard to put me through school, hoping I'd have a bright future, but instead, I turned around and came back to this small town, becoming a poor teacher with no chance of getting rich. I didn't care about their anger. What did it matter to me what they thought? My life wasn't for them. When I had needed them most, they hadn't been there for me. So, why should I be expected to be there for them? I got a teaching job at a private school. The first 2 years, I lived in the dorm. After saving up some money, I used my Provident Fund to take out a loan and bought a small apartment. It wasn't big, but I was very happy. I brought my grandmother to live with me. On the first night in our new home, I held my grandmother and cried. "Grandma, I have a home now. I'll never have to live under someone else's roof again," always looking at others' faces. My grandmother stroked my head and comforted me like she did when I was little. "My girl, you've really done well." 2 years later, I started dating a colleague from the same school. When I first began teaching, I was aloof and not very social. When I encountered difficulties at work, he helped me a lot. When we began discussing marriage, I took him to meet my parents. Immediately, my parents demanded 300,000 yuan as a bride price. I explained that he was an only child, his family had a car and house, and he had a stable job. There was no need for such a high bride price. We weren't selling daughters. My mother pointed at me and scolded, "Ungrateful, disgraceful girl." They hid the household register and threatened that if we didn't give the bride price, there would be no marriage. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't stop the tears. For the first time in years, I was finally worth something to them. My fiancé's family managed to gather the 300,000 yuan, and we went to register our marriage. My parents carefully selected 6 sets of bedding as my dowry. On our wedding night, I looked at the bed covered with wedding quilts, and the years of resentment and bitterness I had kept inside finally burst out. My fiancé held me tightly and wiped away my tears. "It's okay. From now on, you're mine. No one will ever bully you again." My parents gave me life, and maybe they gave me some love, but the love they gave was too meager too scarce, to support me in becoming a happy and cheerful girl. So I've always been indifferent to everything, and I've always felt like I didn't deserve the best, whether it was family, love, or anything else. Until I met my husband. He grew up in a loving environment. He is kind, brave, and fearless. He is free-spirited, optimistic, and positive. During holidays, he took me all over the country, hiking, diving, skiing, camping. We climbed Mount Tai together at night. In the cold, endless dark, he wrapped me up completely in his thick military coat. Afraid my hands would get cold, he wrapped my hands tightly in his palms, holding them close to his mouth to warm them with his breath. When the sun rose, he shouted toward the horizon, "I hope Zhou Lu can always be as happy as a child. I will always love her." By the way, I'm not called girl anymore. That casual, carefree name made it obvious that my life for the past 20 years had been one of being ignored. My full name is Zhou Lu. My husband calls me Zhou Lu, or Lulu. He says in his heart, I am as precious as a dewdrop, and he will carefully hold me in his hands, protecting me. In the 4th year after my marriage, my father passed away. His illness had been evident for a long time. After losing his job, he spent all his savings and took out a loan to buy a big truck, starting long-distance transport. He worked for 10 years, constantly on the road. The long hours of driving and the irregular schedule gradually wore down his health. When my brother graduated, I thought my father could finally take a break. But he said he needed to keep working to help my brother buy a house and get married. On my brother's salary, not only was buying a house impossible, but even taking care of himself was difficult. My father lingered in bed for 2 weeks. He didn't let go until my brother rushed home from out of town to see him one last time. On the day of the cremation, I stood behind my brother, holding the urn, and suddenly tears were streaming down my face. I remembered the first time I met him. He bought a pack of Waha drinks and handed them to me, asking, "Do you like it?" I said, "Yes, I like it." He ruffled my hair, smiling, "If you like it, next time I'll bring you more." Then I remembered the day he came to pick me up. The snow was falling heavily, and he took off his scarf and wrapped it around my head while snow piled up on his own head and shoulders. Pedaling the bicycle, gasping for breath, he turned to reassure me, "We're almost there. Look, that house with the red lanterns at the gate, that's our home." Did I hate him? Honestly, yes, I did. Did I love him? I did, too. Humans are such complex and contradictory creatures. It's impossible to simply love someone or simply hate them. One day, I happened to run into a high school classmate working at the postal savings bank in the county. During our conversation, she suddenly said, "Your mom came to our bank a few days ago and transferred 900,000 yuan, sending it to your brother." It suddenly dawned on me. I had been at my father's bedside when he passed away. One day, he deliberately found an excuse to send me away and had a long conversation with my mother. He must have been arranging the money transfer at that time. But I no longer cared. I had the full love for my husband, and I wasn't the little girl anymore, constantly fearing losing a little love. After my father passed, my mother didn't want to go live with my brother. She said he had just gotten married, and she was afraid her presence would cause conflict between them. I would occasionally visit her. She had aged a lot, and her once strong personality had softened. Sometimes when she made mistakes, I'd scold her, and she would lower her head like a child, not saying a word. Less than half a year later, my mother fell ill, developing severe Alzheimer's disease. She forgot many people, including me, but she always remembered my brother. She kept saying, "Where's Hao Hao? Why hasn't he come to see me? I want to find him." I had no choice but to contact my brother. He rushed back from out of town, still looking tired and worn out. The years of hardship and the weight of responsibility had bent his back. He was no longer the fearless, headstrong little tyrant he once was. He took my mother with him. Before leaving, he handed me a bank card. "Sis, this card has 300,000 yuan, your bride price money. I'm giving it back to you. Mom transferred 900,000 yuan to me a while ago, and I used 600,000 of it for the down payment on a house. I didn't take the card. Instead, I calmly said, "Keep it. Consider it my contribution to Mom's pension." As I turned to leave, I heard my brother's soft voice. "Sis, I'm sorry. You've suffered all these years." I turned around and saw the faint scar by his eye. It reminded me of the time when we were kids. He had rushed in like a brave little bull to protect me from being bullied by children on the street. I smiled and patted his shoulder. "Live a good life, and make sure to come back to visit us during the holidays." On the way home, my husband called me, his voice trembling with excitement, crying like a child. "Lulu, you're pregnant? I'm going to be a dad? Is it true?" "Yes, I'm going to be a mom." From then on, my identity was no longer that of a daughter or an older sister. I was my husband's wife, and I was going to be a mother. I would cherish my family. I would ensure that my child grew up in a world full of love.